I thought I would start today doing kind of a refresher on the water budget that we were dealing with earlier this year, going into the growing season as a kind of a lesson to where we might be going this winter in 25 and 26. Now I'm starting out, this is NASA estimated root zone soil moistures, I think May 12th of 2025. I apologize, the date is not on here, but it was 5/12. And we talked extensively earlier this year about this kind of preceding drought concern for the plains, for the Midwest, even areas of the Mid-Atlantic. You can see the deficits there in soil moisture. But one thing we were feeling better about was the moisture and the water budget to the south of those regions. What I mean by that is we had plenty of rain in the southern high plains. We had flooding, intense flooding at times in areas of the Ohio River Valley, the Tennessee Valley. Coincidentally, I picked this May 12th, kind of right at the start of the season, but we had tornado outbreaks through here. And portions of March, April, and May, plenty of moisture toward the southeast. And we talked how if you went back in the historical record and you looked for drought in this area here, you couldn't really find a lot of significant drought years. Actually, only one that had excess moisture just to the south of it, because as we transport that air mass out of the Gulf or out of the Atlantic and in the middle part of the country, it helps to have additional moisture here to bring further north. And you typically see drought erosion with a map with a pattern that looks like this. And so I'm going to flash forward now to August 4th, just a few months ago, and coincidentally see remained wet in this area here. A few drought areas kind of picked up, particularly Florida. Saw some grass fires there, the far southern Mississippi Valley. But by and large, the drought in this portion of the country was eroded significantly. Some lingering areas, we talked about kind of the I-80 dry areas through the middle part of summer, but it wasn't the significant widespread drought that we were maybe initially concerned about given the kind of preseason moisture issues. And then certainly, if anything, almost too much moisture and severe weather up in the central or the northern plains. And there's kind of a similar lesson and phenomenon that we have to think about for winter. Going into 25 and 26, we're looking here just at the last 14 days of snowfall, much of which is still in some way on the ground just because of how cold we've been over the last kind of 5 to 7 days. In fact, a lot of the snow really just kind of fell over the weekend here, especially across the Midwest. But you're looking at some impressive snowfall values. If we look at the lake effect snow machine, that has been cranking this year. Obviously, you get in the heart of some of those snow bands and the amounts get pretty ridiculous pretty quickly up into the feet. But across Iowa, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, even portions of Missouri here, you're looking at anywhere from like 6 to 9 inches of snow on the ground. We actually got more snow last night that's not even analyzed on this initial analysis. Actually see how close it's up to. This is only through Sunday. And so we've put more snow on the ground kind of in this swath here where we have winter weather advisories now, and there's snow coming down in portions of the Mid-Atlantic at the moment. And this serves a similar, not exact same kind of phenomenon as that moisture reserve in the southeast earlier this year, and it's a reservoir for cold air. Snow, it's ice, obviously, it's sitting there on the ground, and it just allows the air to get that much colder at night, and then you can transport that air further to the south or the southeast. So folks kind of in this corridor here can think of it similarly, that our potential for these cold air outbreaks have increased with that snowpack. And certainly in this area, your potential just for cold mornings and these kind of ice cold Arctic mornings, even here in early December, has increased over the next 7 to 10 days, as long as we keep this snowpack around. It's often why kind of early in the year we look at Canadian shield snowpack. If you can get a strong snowpack here, your chance of kind of advecting that colder air into this region increases, and then you might get snow here and so on and so forth. I'm going to make a snowball analogy here, but it's a little too spot on. And we track this often looking at this map here. We're looking down on the northern hemisphere. This is the Rutgers Snow Lab, great resource to check kind of global snowfall anomalies. But it's looking at the current snow extent across the northern hemisphere, valid as of yesterday. And we see fantastic snow coverage across Siberia. We even take that into account at times, certainly across almost entirety of Canada here. But then look at this. We just looked at this, a decent swath right through the continental U.S. Now, this is just absolute snow extent. We can actually jump over and see the chart departure. And that shows us that, Russia, Siberia is about average. The U.S. is above average, especially through the Missouri River and the Ohio River corridors here, and portions of Central Asia running below average, so kind of the grain belt of Russia into Kazakhstan. And actually, there's a few deficits here picking up the Sierra Nevada. I've heard some folks complaining early in the season over here in the Rockies about relative lack of snowfall. But by and large, this kind of corridor here, our main kind of source region for cold Arctic air, is ahead of schedule, if not on it, and cold air outbreaks are the concern as a result of that as we go through the rest of December here. Now, we can see that just here this morning. If we look down at infrared satellite imagery, our low pressure system that's developing along the East Coast can see the cloud shield associated with that. But actually what I'm looking at here, these very cold temperatures showing up in the plains, these actually aren't clouds. We can tell that because, well, these are clouds here. They're moving. That's the ground, and it's actually the snow cover in Minnesota, South Dakota, western Iowa showing up. Now, we have snow cover all the way, through this area as well, but there's actually low clouds here. We can see that. Low cloud shield starting to depart toward the east. So a sunny and cooler day, at least briefly, for areas across the Midwest here, and then the high clouds to the west. Now, we have rain coming down through wide areas of the southeastern, more in the Carolinas, and we'll talk about the snow in just a second, but with that cold air showing up on infrared satellite tells you just how brutal that chill is. And you can see it looking over at the current temperatures. I'm going to update this because we're just past 6 a.m. at this point. Still down into the single digits, if not sub-zero here in the Dakotas. And then look at to the north. I mean, plenty, that reservoir, if you will, of cold air. We've kind of flipped the script. It's almost like this becomes our gulf of not moisture, but cold air for these cold air outbreaks later in winter. So as long as we keep this area snow covered, I think this kind of winter machine is going to keep on rolling. Jump over and look at the latest radar here this morning. In the Carolinas, plenty of rain there through the southeast. And kind of try to surmise where that snow line is. If I just look at this radar here, there's kind of a few things that catch my eye in that regard. One, there's what we call this bright banding. And if you look over West Virginia here, it almost looks like, a big storm, convective storm with how high those returns are. But that's actually not a thunderstorm. It is what we call bright banding. So it's rain, or it's snow, I should say, that starts to melt into rain. And as it does that, it becomes very reflective to the radar and almost kind of looks like a storm because of how high those reflectivity values come back. And that tells us that that transition between snow to rain is occurring, well, right in here would be my guess. The other part of it is if you just look at the radar presentation of the precipitation here, it looks what we call kind of more glaciated, a little bit more like stretched out, fuzzy maybe would be one word, versus the splotchy. These aren't technical terms. It's just how I read the radar in the morning. Well, this is, coming down as rain, and this is coming down as snow here in the mid-Atlantic. And that transition zone, of which there's more question, is kind of right in here. You can almost see that pushing right through New Jersey, far southeastern Pennsylvania. We can kind of see that here on the ag weather radar, but admittedly not nearly as much resolution just on this one we load on the main page. My cheat, if you've ever watched these videos in winter, I go to Google Maps, and sometimes you have to click on the layers down here on the bottom left and turn on traffic. I like to keep the kind of satellite presentation there. And this is a good kind of proxy for where is the snow actually coming down and accumulating as to where it's causing travel issues, especially on the interstates here. And what you have to do is take into account the time of day. So this is about 6 a.m. It's 7 a.m. Eastern. And so rush hour has started in like Cleveland, Detroit, a little bit here in Chicago, Indy, Columbus. But the kind of rural areas here, they don't really have rush hour, admittedly. So you can see where that traffic's slowing down is where the snow is accumulating quick enough, at least to cause cars to, be affected. And so your kind of impactful snow line, I would draw somewhere right about there. And we've had plenty of snow over here, but you can see a lot of that's getting cleared by the plows and whatnot further to the west, and no active snow falling back toward the west. So it's kind of this area here where we've seen accumulating snow here this morning that's going to continue to shift toward the northeast in a significant way. That low that we talked about is making the jump, so to speak, from the central U.S. across the Appalachians, and it's trying to redevelop east along the coast. So it's kind of neat to see these lows jump over the Appalachians because they have to form somewhere else, usually along the coast. That temperature contrast between the warm Gulf Stream and the cold continent just to the west. And you can see it trying to form here near North Carolina, and that low is going to be quickly pushing up into the northeast. Rainfall spreading over areas of the metro northeast. Unfortunately, cold rain there for folks rooting for snow. And then snow, winter weather advisories, winter storm warnings to the north of that. Look at that just a second here. Here's that simulated radar from the 3-kilometer NAM. Make this valid. Let's do about 7 a.m. Eastern, almost about the current time. Remember that rain snow line? We drew it through West Virginia into southeast Pennsylvania, lining up pretty well with the 3-kilometer NAM forecast here. Snow falling across eastern Ohio, portions of Pennsylvania, upstate New York, Vermont. Remember, we kind of drew that area of impactful snow kind of right in here. That lines up well. Take the forecast through this morning. More rain coming from the mid-Atlantic, especially New Jersey, New York City, much of Connecticut, Rhode Island, Providence, up into Boston. Unfortunately, if you're in this area here, there's a lot of people rooting for snow. This is not your favorite forecast. A lot of cold rain coming for this area. The snow off to the north, especially over the elevations like the Berkshires. Some heavy snow at times here up through Maine. And this takes us all the way into this afternoon. And then this evening, well after sunset here, and you can see this kind of weak nor'easter peeling up toward the northeast, 992 millibars. That's not very deep. So some gusty winds here on the backside of this, but not one of these big news-making nor'easters, I don't think, coming through the end of the day here. Clearing out by tomorrow, and then we have a little clipper system moving through the Great Lakes. We'll see some lake effect snow showers with that. Maybe a light dusting across the Corn Belt. We'll look at all that in just a second here. As a result of that snowfall, wide area of winter weather advisories from Indiana all the way up through Maine, even stretching through the Appalachians here into North Carolina at some of the higher elevations. Have a weak system kind of moving through the Rockies as well. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then winter storm warnings, coast of Maine all the way down into Vermont and New Hampshire. Seeing some of the heavier snowfall here north of those metro areas that you can see are clear of advisories here as of about 6, 7 a.m. Eastern time. If we just look at the 3-kilometer NAM, the accumulated snowfall, you can see up near a foot, not quite making that transition over into like the purples and the pinks where we get up near a foot, but certainly over kind of like 8 inches here in portions of northern Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, coastal Maine here, and a nice swath of decent snow accumulations even through New York. And just this morning here, this forecast started about 6C. And so you're looking at after midnight accumulations through Ohio and Pennsylvania as well. But you'll notice not really the mid-Atlantic or the northeast metro area is not seeing much in the way of accumulating snowfall. Maybe Boston flips over for a bit to get kind of like a slushy dusting, if you will. If we look at big picture, we're starting to see a bit of a pattern. I don't want to call it a change yet. I think we might get there as we go through December, but I'll call it like a moderation or kind of a calming down of the weather pattern a little bit. If you just look at the jet stream level winds here this morning, you can see this trough associated with the current low that we just talked about. And if we look over to the Pacific, so often over the past 2-3 weeks, I feel like we've been seeing these kind of bigger extensions starting to race across. They maybe break down here, or they break down here over portions of North America. But this one now, it's breaking down into a trough well over here, almost kind of west of the Gulf of Alaska, south of the Aleutians. That's allowing this ridge to develop over the west. We haven't seen a lot of rainfall for California. We mentioned the snow deficit in the Rockies. It kind of leaves us in this kind of weaker northwest flow pattern, I think, over the next 7 to 10 days. And we'll see kind of systems clip around through the Midwest. We'll see a few try to develop in the southeast, but I think leaving portions of the west dry, portions of the central U.S. dry, and this cold air corridor set up by that snowpack is going to continue churning, at least for the next 7 days or so. Now, partly responsible for that is this deep trough here over the Hudson Bay, kind of just shifted to the north of it. But this general pattern, deep trough here, ridge to the west, is it's looking like that positive TNH pattern that we've talked about so much here in November. Starting here in early December, it's December 2nd, it's starting to look like that. And it was something that we're keen to keep an eye on as we went into the heart of winter. If we're going to keep this deep Hudson Bay trough around, well, the lake effect snow machine is going to keep cranking. We're going to get these cold air injections into the central U.S., at times down to the southeast. Snow, clippers like snow events through the northern half of the country, and then some questionable precipitation to the south. We'll look at all that kind of in the long-range forecast here, if that sticks around. I think another reason we're seeing kind of the pattern moderate, maybe get, quote-unquote more boring, is we're starting to lose momentum a bit. Now, over the last 2 to 3 months, Eric and I have mentioned, since September, as we got into October, the forecast started to look favorable for this increase in atmospheric momentum, a lot of which came out of the Pacific, came across North America, caused the more intense weather that we've seen not only here this morning across the east, but over the last 7 to 14 days, areas of California at times, and then through the Pacific Northwest. And that trend is very obvious just looking at the last kind of month and a half or so. Now, this only takes us out to present day here in early December, but if I show you the forecast for the same anomaly, we're coming down. In fact, we're kind of coming back down, if you believe this forecast from the CFS, by mid-December into territory that we were at, back in September, even early October. Now, it's not to say that this is just going to shut off the low pressure train. This is still getting into the heart of winter. Here's the winter solstice here, and expect plenty of weather to talk about, but maybe not quite as vigorous of systems moving through And kind of depends on which side of the block that we get on, if an atmospheric block does develop as a result of this lack of momentum here. But it's kind of curious to see, as long as we went with that above average momentum here kind of through the end of October, November, into early December here, by mid-December starting to lose some of that. We'll have to keep an eye on what that means for the forecast. Another kind of weather phenomenon I've noticed over the last kind of 2 weeks or so, when I wake up in the morning and look at satellite imagery, this was yesterday morning. We've had a lot of Tule fog early in the year for California. We're getting into Tule fog season. You think of kind of the winter months is when that picks up. This is this fog that sets up in the Central Valley of California. It's kind of named for the Tule grass that grows in this area. Lake Tulare is kind of down here where that fog often settles into just before it fades away. And we've seen plenty of it this year. This is just yesterday. It was actually a little bit weaker yesterday, but it has come on strong this year and early, like in November. And one way I was able to kind of see it historically, it's kind of neat. I went to our local weather page. I actually typed in fittingly Tulare, California, which is right there in the kind of southern Central Valley, the San Joaquin Valley more specifically. And if I pull up the year-to-date solar radiation anomaly, and I start way back in January of 2025, you'll notice that look at all these stretches of above average sunshine in January, even parts of February for California, increasing the cumulative anomaly. This was the drought that we were worried about to start the water year, that is like early winter in California. This played a role in the unfortunate January wildfires in Southern California. And so we had a lot less Tule fog last year in winter. So more sun got to the ground, especially in morning. That fog typically kind of fades away by midday, but that's still time you could have accrued solar radiation. We're seeing that lack of Tule fog in early 2025. Now, we had the kind of curiously late rainfall, like late for the monsoon season, but early in the water year in like October and early November here for California. So we got wet across a lot of the areas in the Central Valley, even Southern California, where we had, in some cases, record rainfall rates for the last 2 or 3 weeks. And we've had way less solar radiation as a result. In fact, getting very, very negative on those anomalies, at least looking at the chart here. And all these days of Tule fog, and that's what this is, these heavy anomalies here. Because they haven't had a lot of like upper level cloud cover during this time, and plenty of Tule fog. If this sticks around, this is a travel hazard, like any fog in the morning. It can be very thick at times, especially in kind of the low-lying areas of the Central Valley. So could be a continued concern, but in some cases, the Tule fog can be beneficial for some of the crops there as they vernalize, kind of an extra source of moisture during the winter months. I do want to look at this big picture. This is the 500 millibar height anomalies, those troughs and ridges that we talked about. I kind of already mentioned the setup to this pattern. I'm going to make this valid about noon today on Tuesday. Shows us where that current trough is over the mid-Atlantic, influencing that kind of quasi-nor'easter that we talked about, that deep Hudson Bay trough, evident here on the 500 millibar forecast from the European model, and that ridge out to the west. This is kind of setting up our next 5 to 7 days where we're going to have systems cutting around this. These weak clipper systems as they come through, the lake effect snow machine rolling, and ridging out west. That's going to put into question if we're going to get any kind of big systems racing through the middle part of the country or getting rainfall into California. So I'm going to play this forward now. We see a little weak, almost cut off low sneaking through the Four Corners region tomorrow on Wednesday. See a deeper lobe of this Hudson Bay trough, this deep trough here of the Hudson Bay, much colder air associated with that. If I could pull up the current temperatures, you can see how cold that air is way up there over the Hudson Bay. Now I got to refine my spot here. That low kicks out into the plains on Wednesday, Thursday. It'll actually produce a wide area of precipitation here along the Gulf Coast as we go through the end of this week. But much colder air will be filtering all the while into the Midwest, especially areas that have deeper snowpack. Not only from the system here this morning, but over the weekend, we're going to see very cold temperatures on Thursday and Friday. We keep this ridge out west, but it starts to break down. We start to get a little bit flow coming over the top of it. We can see that here moving through kind of Montana before it breaks down further in the Midwest. But still, the trajectory of a lot of these systems is out of the Northwest, where plenty of cold air will be flowing into the middle part of the country. See some flow now getting across the Pacific Northwest here. Taking the forecast further out through Sunday. A few little weak systems coming over here, but still generally this kind of pattern. Starting to get warmth back maybe into the southern plains as we go further out into the forecast. Stronger ridging developing early next week over the western U.S. Another one of these systems kind of This one a little bit more defined moving through the Midwest, maybe like early next week. We'll keep an eye on that. But again, not one of these kind of big cranking systems moving up through the Southwest where it's going to have, a huge rain, severe component plus snow on the backside. More of a kind of weaker system to watch. Ridge still kind of cranking over California here, likely to be much warmer early next week, but just enough flow over the Pacific Northwest to keep rainfall in the forecast. And again, these little clipper systems coming through. This is now Wednesday. Colder air coming in behind that late next week. I don't want to talk too much specifics here because we're getting pretty far out in the forecast. But finally, by the end of next week, that ridge starts to work west, at least from the CCMWF forecast. There's some support in this in other models, which is why I pointed out. And that will be something closer to what, I'm not going to call it a pattern change yet because we still have this Hudson Bay trough, but starting to get some ridging north of that. And just as always, when you get 10 days out in the forecast, start getting some question marks here. But I want to keep an eye on where that ridge is going because it was so dominant early in the forecast. Now, the short story on all that with respect to temperatures, well, if you're in the middle part of the country or the eastern part of the country, it'll be a roller coaster at times. But by and large, the arrow is pointing down on the thermometer as far as trends go. So as we just wake up tomorrow morning looking at the low temperatures tomorrow morning on Wednesday, very cold air through the Mississippi Valley with that snowpack, fresh snowpack in the east with some lingering clouds, cold air there, 20s and teens through the northeast. Still looking at single digits in portions of the northern plains, a relative quote-unquote warm-up for areas kind of in between here, into the 20s, and but coming right back, crashing down with that much stronger cold front that moves through on Wednesday to the point where Thursday morning could be looking at very low temperatures across Iowa, Minnesota, Red River of the North, Illinois getting down into the single digits. It wouldn't surprise me if a few areas here actually get colder than what's presented here on the forecast, just because the bottom can fall out of these at times over deep snowpack. On Friday, that shifts further to the east. Remember that snowpack that we put down across New England and the eastern Corn Belt, now serving as a reservoir for that Arctic air and getting down into the single digits in this area. It's at 9 in Cincinnati, negative, sub-zero in portions of Illinois, getting down towards 0 near like Ohio, like Defiance area, staying warm over the southeast, staying warm in west, but largely middle part of the country in the east, staying cold, and then another kind of round of that next week. And this could, again, bottom out even further than some of these forecasts suggest, but warmer toward the west, some of that warmth trying to get into the plains now. I mentioned that on the forecast. If we just quickly look at the 7-day precip anomalies, I don't think it'll surprise us too much to see this corridor here wetter because that ridge was very strong over California, but was breaking down at times over the Pacific Northwest. That's going to allow these little clipper systems. We call them Alberta clippers because they typically start in the Alberta province. They can swing this way or that way when they come down through this area. Plenty of snowfall initially here in Montana, and these systems will sneak through the Midwest at times, allowing some snowfall to percolate in here, but shifting relatively drier, at least with respect to normal. But I think this corridor stays, with precipitation in the forecast in the form of these kind of moving light snow showers that will remain to be the case. As far as the southeast, we have the initial system coming through. I'll talk about that in the forecast in just a second. That's producing some decent rainfall values there relative to average. But as I take this forecast further out and do like 4 to 10 days, start to see some of that erode as more of those clipper systems focus on the Midwest. You can see some lake effect snow now showing up, even from the ECMWF precip anomalies out 4 to 10 days at this point. And the Pacific Northwest, Willamette Valley, coastal Oregon, certainly portions of Washington, even over towards Spokane, northern Idaho, Golden Triangle of Montana, portions of the Canadian Prairie, looking wet initially, and then snow east of the divide here, and certainly up in the mountains there, Bitterroot Range, etc. And just enough flow staying across the Pacific Northwest to keep this kind of clipper trade and the northwest precipitation rolling, while California and the southwest shift over much drier than they were just a month ago or even 3 weeks ago. Walk through those precip events now as we just kind of look at the ECMWF precip and type forecast going through the future. Let's catch this up to where we're about now here. This takes us through lunchtime on Thursday. I kind of already mentioned the northeast of the New England threat, but we do have another one of these clipper systems developing on the back side of it. I mentioned this earlier. It's this little southwest system that's going to come down and be our weather maker over the next 48 to 72 hours. That tracks through finally Colorado Rockies, Denver area, getting in some snowfall through like Pueblo and New Mexico. That starts to wrap up into a low here, coastal low near Houston, Louisiana. A little bit of snow here on the backside over Oklahoma, portions of Texas, but rainfall coming for the southeast, southern Mississippi River Valley, little clipper system. I mentioned this here in the forecast earlier, moving through the Great Lakes. Another one of these systems here on the back side of this along the Continental Divide. And decent rainfall coming from the southeast. We saw that in the 7-day anomalies. And some snowfall now for the mid-Atlantic. Areas that are missing out on it here this morning. Virginia, D.C. area may be looking at a modest snowfall event as we go through the end of the week. We'll look at those totals in just a second here. That wraps up, heads east, not wrapping up into one of these big nor'easters, at least initially on this ECMWF forecast. Another one of these quick systems moving around that trough with that very cold air that came in late in the week through the Hudson Bay, areas of Ontario. Then another one of these systems here, Willamette Valley, wet, areas of western Washington, certainly Idaho, Montana, Wyoming. As this kind of weak clipper moves through, you'll see I mentioned, not one of these patterns that's going to have plenty of severe weather, and on the southern side with this huge snow swath to the north. Just kind of these weak systems. That one cuts through the Midwest. Not too much to talk about. Plenty of flow heading up into the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia. Another system moving through on Tuesday. Again, pretty consolidated, isolated precipitation event, largely in the form of snow here across the Midwest early next week. You can see that flow coming across the Pacific Northwest. And as I take this forecast further out, we're starting to break down that ridge over California. It's starting to move west, and that precipitation trying to get further to the south, but you can see it really kind of isolated to the Pacific Northwest. Our flow remains in this configuration, and we start to go over drier in the southeast as we get further out into this forecast. I'll stop it there. I'm almost at 10 days at this point, so I don't want to talk too specifically about each one of these lows, but that general pattern is what we're expecting over the next 7 to 10 days. As we go beyond that, if I take the forecast just one day further, it's kind of fun to do that. Let's go all the way out to day 11. Look at the 500 millibar height anomalies from the ECMWF. This is from the ensemble, and it also has that ridge that was over California retrograding over into the North Pacific. Not even like the Gulf of Alaska, like, again, south of the Aleutians, north of Hawaii. That's allowing some ridging to start to build in to the southern U.S., troughing into the Pacific Northwest. This would start to get rainfall down further into Oregon, maybe Northern California. This would certainly stay cooler for the Northeast if this trough develops here, but starting to lose that Hudson Bay trough out in this kind of mid-December forecast. So curious to see how this plays out. I think we're going to get a brief warm-up in here into the central part of the country, the Midwest, December 12th. But the long-term, I'm not going to call it seasonal, but the kind of monthly support for a lot of warmth building back into this area just isn't really there. From climatology and some of the MJO movement. And so I think this is maybe looking at a more transient, brief warm-up, not one that I think is going to stick around through the holidays. We'll look at that and kind of keep ourselves updated as we go further into the forecast. But a lot of the support continues for cold air, especially with the snowpack that we built up. That's going to resist ridging across the north-central part of the country in the kind of medium to long range. You want to shift over and look at those long-term temperature grids that we often do. Over the next 5 days from the ECMWF ensemble, certainly cold across much of the Canadian Shield, the Midwest, and the eastern U.S. We already kind of talked about that. 5 to 10 days as we get into next week, that dominant ridge over the west. Look at all the warmth now pushing all the way through the Pacific Northwest into states like Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, much colder over Alaska. And that is pretty consistent across the European model, the GFS and the AIFS. But if we look out to the third panel, that is out into that long range, now December 12th through the 17th, there's that warmth trying to push back into the southern plains. But you'll see it's being resisted in its northward extent by the snowpack here. That snowpack acting almost like a shield, if you will, against that warmer air that's maybe trying to push into the Midwest or Iowa. And AFS has it getting a little bit further in, especially into like the central Corn Belt and the southeast. The AFS is always going to be a little bit more bold in its prediction here than the ensembles, but certainly some question marks as to whether it's able to do that. And we keep this reservoir, cold air up in the Canadian Prairie, Northern Plains, Montana, especially with how wet, I'm using the term wet, but snowy they'll be, and then the Northeast generally expected to stay cold throughout the forecast period here. So question marks as to how extensive this warm-up will be. I think it'll be, at the most, maybe kind of 5 days, might be a weekly transitional period before cold air and winter returns to the forecast. As far as the end of December goes, we'll talk about that in just a moment here. One thing I want to mention, Eric's been talking about this, is we do think that this current La Nina, which is relatively weak, we can see it's only we fell just about -1 Celsius, maybe a tick below that here at the end of November, early December here, but it's been warming up early this month. Now, there's always this question mark this time of year because we typically reach our peak La Nina right around the holidays, if not our peak El Nino in that scenario. And it tends to weaken as we go into spring. And kind of curious, is this that minimum where we're going to be warming up those waters through the rest of winter? If it is, that's a pretty early end, an early December. And it could be relevant for the spring forecast. Is it going to go, back down and peak, in the holidays or get even, more negative in January? That's happened plenty of times, even this decade. We'll have to keep an eye on that because it's likely to linger further into the next spring. And keeping an eye on this because it's, you're looking at like a week or two of warm up now. And if I look at the hobmillers, those trade winds over the Central Pacific, well, if we look back in time, which is up on this graph, this actually takes us through almost the entire month of November here. We had plenty of trade wind activity through the Central Pacific, keeping that La Nina around. Actually, the peak of it, I should say the valley, was in late November. That lines up very well with this trade wind surge, looking at the analysis. But the forecast, so the black line and below, out into December, far less trade wind activity. Actually, the trade wind activity is shifting over here into the Indian Ocean. See this shift that's occurring. We had the Kelvin wave move across. You can actually see that here in the form of those trade winds kind of regressing there and then shifting back over here. This looks like MJO phase 1, like AIDR 1 to me, that full transition over. So there's some question marks. Actually, I had some skepticism that we'd get that full transition, but it did occur. It's about 40 to 50% whether it happens or not. And we saw that transition occur. Looking at climatology, I mentioned this a moment ago with the MJO. I'm going to blow this up, make this much bigger. With the MJO making that transition into phase 8, then potentially into phase 1 by the end of December. Well, phase 8 for like the middle of December, big trough over the Great Lakes. Cold air transport into the middle part of the country. Busy for the Northeast, busy for Montana. And that corridor here, looking kind of similar to what we've been expecting to start out December here. Maybe ridging over Alaska, which has been a little bit different, but the support is there for additional winter weather, I think, through the middle part of December. Now, we get out all the way into phase 1, like the end of the year, still seeing, this takes us all the way out through like the holidays, that trough, maybe moving east a little bit, but that's still pretty friendly for cold air winter weather in the central and eastern part of the country, maybe more so for like the mid-Atlantic or the Northeast as we warm back up in Western Canada. So that's the forecast right now. It's also not, this gets a little bit more favorable for California if we make that full transition, which is often the case. We'll have to keep an eye on that. That transitional period that we're seeing in like the middle part of December, if we get that warm up in the central U.S., that might bode better for California as well. If we jump over and look at the precipitation forecast, however, still looking much drier from the ECMWF forecast. This is the 30 days from the 5th of December through the 5th of January, wet in this corridor here. Kind of seeing those clipper systems here. Actually staying a little bit drier for the Northeast, the ECMWF extended model here, but I have some skepticism about that if this Hudson Bay trough does return, in fact. As far as the temperature forecast goes, I'm actually going to play the ECMWF temperature forecast in 7-day rolling windows here. So it tells us that we're going to try to get that warm up. Remember, December 11th through the 18th, there's that 7-day window out through the middle of December. We're resisting that because of all the snowpack here. Brief warm up out through like the 20th, and then I think the holidays, we're shifting back colder in this area here, that reservoir of cold air that we've talked about. And kind of piece that together. If we look at the December 8th through January 7th temperature forecast, colder in this corridor here, you would expect, precipitation events that cut through here to be on the snowier side and drier in this area here. And we kind of generally see that from the ECMWF extended model. I think more question marks exist over here for New England and the Northeast, maybe the Mid-Atlantic, depending on if we can get some of these proper nor'easters to set up or not. There's been some kind of issues with that this year with them racing off to the east. We saw that in the forecast. If we look at the week 3 to 4 precipitation outlook from the CPC, generally colder in this area here, warmer, trying to capture that brief warm up here of the southern U.S. that we saw kind of starting around the 11th or the 12th. And then as far as precipitation, actually going wetter for the Northeast. So I don't disagree with that. I can see why they're kind of leaning that way. And then certainly wetter with that flow coming around into the Pacific Northwest for Montana and the Continental Divide. I'm going to leave it there today. I think I'm at my time at this point, but I appreciate you watching, and Eric will talk with you all on Wednesday.